Hey guys, welcome to this brand new course in which we're going to see some interesting gambits from Black's point of view. And the course will be divided again on a few parts where you're going to see some of the popular, I think, gambits. In general, what can we say about, first of all, I suppose you know what is a gambit. This is a opening where you sacrifice, it could be a pawn or 2 pawns, even a piece sometimes, but normally you sacrifice something in order to get compensation in terms of, it could be better development or creating a nice center or creating an attacking position. And obviously with black it's a bit more difficult to play gambits because you start second, and it's much more risky than playing this for white, but still there are a few ones who deserve some attention. And we're going to start with the Latvian Gambit. This occurs after white goes knight f3, and black now suddenly wants to play his own King's Gambit, but with the tempo down. And we know that the King's Gambit itself doesn't have a great reputation for white. So imagine for black, of course, it also looks even more suspicious. But still, white have to know what to do. And not many people are familiar with this opening for white. So now we're going to explore what are the main lines. First of all, if you are a white player and you face this for the first time, you have to think a lot because there are so many options for white. White can obviously capture knight e5, he can take the other pawn, he can move the bishop to c4, the knight, the d3, d4. And if you don't know what is the best, it's not easy to find really. It's not only one move, you have to find, as we'll see, a sequence of moves. So maybe we should start with first with the rare moves, like for example if white is a player who is not very confident and he prefers to play some solid positions, he can even think of the move d3, which is of course totally fine for white, but obviously he is blocking the bishop, and now black can just develop, and black is very comfortable already. I think the game is equal, and even black have some possibilities. For example, if white goes to pin the knight and he hopes about knight d5, that maybe he can do something. Now black also can pin this knight, which is a bit more annoying because sometimes you want just to take here on c3, take on e4, and white will have this bad pawn structure. And if he wants to avoid it and he takes on a5, then after d5, of course, black is, he has a super position. So it means that white have to do something a bit more active if he wants to fight for advantage. d3 is definitely not a good move. And then let's see the other move, which is d4. It also looks okay for white because it's a normal move, and white wants to develop his dark square bishop and to make space for the queen. But this is not the most critical line as well. Now black should take on e4. There is a move d6 which could lead to the Philidor line. There is some old Philidor kind of gambit which Philidor himself invented, but there is no need to play d6. Black should simply take on e4. And after knight e5, now just black is moving the knight to f6, defending from queen h5 check, and now his next move is d6 or d5, depending on the occasion. Let's say bishop c4, of course you go d5, and if any other move, like bishop g5, d6, attacking the knight, and when the knight goes back, you can just develop bishop e7. Let's say he also develops something like this, castle, castle, and now for instance d5. and black have again a very good position. So I think, yeah, this is what you need to know about the moves with the d pawn, the likes of d3 and d4. Now let's see the other possibilities. Or if white moves the knight to c3, which also looks quite natural. Now black here has a choice. He can also move the knight to c6 or knight to f6, but I believe the main line and the best probably is to capture on e4. Because now when white takes with the knights, it looks like, okay, white has developed two knights, so he is ahead in the development. It must be better for white. But this allows, of course, black to play d5 and to make this nice center. And now white has either to retreat with his knight somewhere, g3 or c3, either to go for the complications after knight takes e5. I think better is for white to go back with a knight somewhere, but this of course doesn't bring any problems for black, and even black can push the pawn. And now white again has to move the knight. It's kind of strange mix between the Alekhine defense reversed, where white actually, in Alekhine defense, black only moves one of his knights because he is under pressure, but now both knights have to move. First this now from b1 goes to the king side, and then the other one can go to d4, b3, but it's kind of, strange. Or if he goes there, of course you start with this move again, and this is something similar to the previous one, but already even in better version for black, because the bishop is on d6, and then you start to put pressure on the knight. Let's say here you just go c5 and then queen c7, knight c6. It's even is a bit better for black. And if white goes knight e5, now what to do? Should black take the knight, or maybe queen e7 also deserve attention, you might say? Actually, both moves are good, but probably it's better to take the knight. Queen e7 looks super strong for black, because you count on this check, and then after g6 white will lose some of his knights, and it's not working to capture here, because then black can take here, and then you can take the knight, but he can play d4, and then when you take, this check is coming, so then you have to play g6 and things like this. But it's around equal. But more simple is if you skip the move queen e7, because anyway you cannot avoid this check and g6 knight takes. Maybe better is to capture, and when they give check g6, knight g6, black just takes, and now when white takes the rook, black has to, of course, develop the bishop to close this diagonal, otherwise bishop c4 might be coming. And black have two knights, usually they go queen e5, and now, for example, king f7. Even if they capture the e-pawn, it's not that dangerous. I think this is very good for black, because you just move the knights next, and they're a little bit better in the moment, the two knights, comparing to the white rook. So this is not a problem as well for black. Okay, so you might say, well, this looks fantastic, everything is fine. And then we have to see two more moves before moving to the main one. Of course, first, what if white just takes this pawn, as they do in the King's Gambit? Here the little advantage comparing to the King's Gambit is that the move knight f3 actually allows black to push the pawn, so basically white have to move the knight again. Otherwise in the King's Gambit, of course, white doesn't have such a move. And now he can go to d4 or e5, those are the main options. e5 looks a bit more ambitious maybe, because it leaves the d4 square for the pawn, and then this knight can go to c4. Again, now you have to stop this check from h5, and now if white goes d4, it is not a problem, you just take the pawn, and it's, yeah, I think very good for black. There is this tricky line where they go bishop e2, and they want to give check from h5. This probably is, yeah, the one which here white can try to play for advantage, but it is only if black don't know what to do, and here black simply has to move the bishop, and after this check to move the king. It looks now very bad because knight f7 is coming, but the thing is that after knight f7 there is always queen e8, and then the bishop on h5 is hanging, and if white takes the rook, then this knight probably won't go out of the corner. So usually white goes first knight c3, and he wants to keep this for later until black goes d6, but d6 is perfectly fine, and it all goes to this variation, which I think is good for black. Now white can take immediately, after which if they take now, black can both take with the queen and with the knight. I think both are okay. With the queen, of course, you trade the queens. With the knight, you keep the queens. I believe maybe this is just more safe to exchange the queens, because after all your king is in the middle, and then you just at some point you go and take. Of course, you can first develop your pieces, and if white wants to keep the queens, he usually goes g4, because now already he wants to take the rook. But in this case, when you capture, you can go back to f6. This is what all the people do. I have checked there are dozens of games in this position. Everyone goes knight f6, and then white goes g5. So the idea is that if you move the knight, actually they go g6, and the knight surprisingly will escape. So normally here people just give the knight, they take those pawns, and later at some point you take this knight on h8. So when you take it, it will be exchanged down. Right now is a rook down, rook for one pawn, which is of course not good enough. But yeah, when you take the knight, it will be exchanged for pawn and pair bishops and knight. The white king is in the center. It's not clear where he will castle, so it looks good. And the engine even suggests here another move, knight c6, which have been never tried. And the plan is that when they take, you go knight e5, and immediately you don't care about those pawns, f5, but you want to jump with the knight on f3. And for white it's very difficult to stop it, because, okay, let's say he takes and you take on f5, attacking the knight, and he defends the knight. Now he is already losing, because he's losing the queen. So knight c6 deserves serious attention, and it shows that this is, yeah, not a dangerous line as well. Alright, so now let's check the main two lines for white. One of them is bishop to c4, which again, it gives black a choice between knight c6, even maybe d6 is again this strange line in Philidor where sometimes they play f5, knight f6 of course, but knight f6, knight f5, and then he's threatening knight f7. So maybe here the main move is the best as well, where black takes, and after knight e5, white have two threats, knight f7 obviously, and queen h5. And here black usually goes d5. There is this move queen g5, which looks possible, but after knight f7, queen g2, or rook f1, probably there is no follow-up. and you just lose the rook. So black will have to go for d5. And now white have a choice. Of course, he can move the bishop, but it will be good for black, because whenever he moves the bishop to b3 or e2, black just plays knight f6, or maybe even queen g5 now actually is stronger, but knight f6 is good enough. So basically the whole plan for white, by playing this line with bishop c4, is to give the check from h5. Obviously black has only one move, and white has to capture. Now this is the beginning of the complications, where now black has to decide what to do. You can take the knight, you can take the bishop, or you can play knight f6 to attack the queen as well. Taking the bishop, of course, is very bad, because after knight h8, yeah, you lose a lot of material and maybe even getting checkmated. So it is between pawn takes knight and knight f6. Now let's try to see both of them to understand what is better. Knight f6 is basically forcing white to give the check from e5. There is no better move. Otherwise, if he goes with the queen anywhere else, you just take the knight, he takes the rook, and you take the bishop. So queen e5 check. And now you should not move the king, but bishop to e7. And it looks like black could be in trouble, but actually I think black is perfectly fine here, because if white takes the rook now, again you just take the bishop, and then you develop. Knight to6 is coming, you move the bishop to e6, and this knight from h8, I don't think he will go back, so this will mean that you have two pieces for knight. And now usually white gives this check, and now c6. And again, if he takes the rook, of course you take the bishop, knight c6 follows, and you develop. So it means that actually white cannot take the rook. It's not good for white to win the rook. And then what else he has to play? He has to take the bishop. After black takes with the queen, this is forcing this endgame, let's say rook g8 and g3. Now there are many games. Black is trying different systems. Now you can play bishop g4 to trade the light square bishop to take control, or later on them bishop h3. Most people play actually c5 and then knight c6. Black is a pawn down, but he has good compensation. The evaluation is like, yeah, it's very slight advantage for white, which is, I think, okay, considering the beginning of this opening. So this is one option for black, knight f6. If black wants to go for more complications, he can capture. And now white have the choice between taking the rook or queen g6 check as well. It's very interesting. For example, after queen g6, black have to go to d7. This is the best move. Otherwise, on e7 you can suffer on the dark squares. Maybe they go d3, bishop h, bishop g5. So the best move is king d7. And then white obviously has to take. So here white is a piece down. He has 3 pawns, and he probably can win the pawn on e4, so eventually it could be 4. The black king is in the center, but it's not so easy for white to create attack. Usually here most of the people play knight f6, and then white is developing the knight, and now queen e7. This is the most popular line for black, and white have, of course, some attack, but he has to play very energetic to find something dangerous, because now they're trying to bring this bishop into the game. It could be tried with d3 or b3. b3 looks kind of more safe for white, but now you have, for instance, rook h6, and if queen f5, king d8, of course, is coming, and this endgame is just no problem for black. d3 probably is more dangerous for black, because the bishop comes now into the play instantly, and black has to be very careful, because now white wants to castle queenside or rook d1, the d5 is open. In most of the games, black did not play the best moves, and I think the best is d2 check, just to try to close this d file, because if white captures queen d6, this has been played a couple of times, and now it's not that simple for white to bring the rooks on d1, or even I think before that, before knight f6 also, I think it's good to play queen f6, and then yeah, this is a bit, I think maybe it's maybe even more simple for black, because obviously white will not take, but if he moves the queen, then okay, you have time to develop your pieces, so this also deserves attention. And this is the line where white takes queen g6. If white takes the rook instead, now in this moment we are exchanged down, and it's important to defend this knight. This is the best move, king f7, preparing bishop g7, and then the white queen will be a little bit in danger, because she has only h7 square, so once you bring the bishop, then already knight f6 sometimes white has to be careful for the queen. So normally they move the queen now to use the fact that the pawn is pinned, and then you have to move the bishop here, and when they move the bishop back now, this is a line where black is exchanged down, but he has a few good options here. The most popular move is knight c6, which is quite natural. This is the only move. Then bishop h6. Again, you just develop and gain time on the white queen, and after f4 you can keep, develop. Here the engine suggests some to insert a5 or something like this. Here black has good compensation, but of course it's not clear. Or another line which has been tried is c5 and then c4, which also looks interesting. White have to move the bishop, and then again you chase the bishop, so he has to make some space, and then yeah, you can just develop, and then b5, knight c6, you move the bishops, the queen, and now with this c3, white has some issues now with the knight. He would have to go to a3 and c2, the bishop obviously is blocked, so yeah, this is also very, I think, good for black. So basically you have a choice in this system for black, that you can go knight f6, which leads to this possibly this endgame with a pawn down, or this line where it is a bit more messy, but everywhere I believe black is totally fine. And now let's finally see the main move, which is knight takes e5. This is I think by far the best move for white, because you just take the pawn and you create queen h5 check. And now the main move is queen f6, but I have checked in the database the second most popular move, which looks a bit strange initially to me. It is knight to c6. There are many games surprisingly with this move. And now there is some kind of idea, first of all, what is going on after queen h5, but most people are afraid to give this check and they take on c6. So just quickly let's see what is the idea for black in this opening. Basically black wants to open his bishops, and then, okay, let's say white can play something like this, and then bishop c5, creating some threats on the diagonal. So white usually goes d3, and black is developing. White also can develop, and if white plays something solid like this, black is a pawn down. He has some compensation. Usually they take, and now, yeah, let's say, of course, white can capture with the knight. If takes with the pawn, then the engines are suggesting something like this, where the evaluation is that black has very good compensation for the pawn. Maybe even you can try to win the pawn back. Sometimes you can go bishop d4 and take the knight and take the pawn, like for example now, or also you can play here and then go back and again either double the rooks, either move the bishop to d4 or b4. So it is possible line, but how about if they give this check and then here you go knight f6? This is a very important line, and I think very dangerous for black, because now white have to know what to do. The choice is between queen h4 and queen h3, and both have been played equally, which shows that many people they don't know what is the difference. The difference is that after queen h4, black goes rook g8, and then white have to take. Rook g4 is coming with a tempo. This is the big difference. And now white still can get some good position, but he already has to find some moves which are not obvious. Now queen h6 is the best, not queen h3. And after this check, it looks like the white king is in danger, because now it could be knight d4 or queen e7, but yeah, queen e7 is the main move, and it's very messy position. You see, it's very interesting for blitz or rapid, because if you know and white don't know, first he will have to spend a lot of time, and second he might made a mistake. Knight c3 is obviously the best move, and then black takes and jumps with the knight, threatening mate, and threatening also, of course, in case of queen e3, knight c2. So this is a very unclear position, by the way. Castle is the only move. Obviously black takes, and after king h1, now there are still dozens of games in which most of them black goes knight g4, which looks active, but and now also it's good. But white should take this pawn. This is the best move for white. Some people go back, and then yeah, like something like h3, for example. The engine here likes a lot white, because after, let's say, h3 and then rook e1, and then he can push d4 and open up the bishop, black will be in trouble, probably. And he suggested, the machine suggested here the move d5 as the best. And the evaluation is, yeah, around equal. There is no rook e1 because of knight g3. And yeah, black is trying to develop. If you can somehow develop and castle queenside, it will be okay. But the problem is that here in this line, white have queen h3. And already, comparing to the other line, you don't have this rook g4 thing. So basically, if you take, then already white is much better. In this case, usually people sacrifice the exchange. They take here, but this is not a very good line for black. White can play whatever he wants, and basically there is some compensation, but not enough, because black doesn't have any threats and white is just exchange up. He has many options what to do. Of course, still there is some chance that you can do something. For example, I have checked one sample line, which originally the engine says it's white is much better. But now he suggested, instead of taking on e4, which most people do, how about this move bishop g4? And it's not so simple, yeah. Let's say f3 and then you just castle queenside. And it's very messy. There are so many options for white, but also for black. It's a very complicated game. So it is maybe possible as a surprise if you analyze this deeply, and especially for the short time controls. But the main move is queen f6. And then white has to play d4. If he goes knight c4, this, by the way, is also not so bad, knight c4, but of course white should not go knight f3 or knight d3, because when black takes, already black will have advantage. So he always have to go back to c4, and then black takes, and let's say knight c3. This is one of the possible lines. And now black usually is moving his queen. It could be to g6 or f7. g6 looks kind of more normal, because you protect the pawn and you put pressure on g2. But then after d3, most of the time they go bishop b4, and white goes bishop d2, and there is such a possible line, take, knight f6 for example, which looks decent, but of course white is always a bit better. And now maybe better is to take with the queen, but then of course white takes on e4. Most people take with the pawn, and they play this, which is a bit better for white, but it is playable, I suppose. The other line is queen f7 instead of queen g6. So if they take, it will be d5. And then white usually goes back. And now the main move is c6, although there are some other options. And the idea is that if they play d3, d3 is the main move. Of course, okay, maybe first we have to say, what if they take? The line goes d5 and knight g5, and queen goes back to f6. The knight has to go back, and basically then the game settles a bit, and you just play something like this, where black is a pawn down, but he has activity on the king side, some pressure on the f-file, and there is some compensation. But d3 is believed to be the main move, because white is not interested to take the pawn so much, but just to develop very quickly his pieces. And then this actually line is surprisingly popular, because there is a lot of theory, and here white is much better, and he has this idea, for example, knight takes and then knight b5, and then there is not a good way to defend here. So usually black, because if you go queen f6, queen h5, and then g6, queen takes d5, so usually black just gives the bishop, then he takes on f2. But this is a very tricky line for white. If you don't know it, it looks very dangerous, because now black have this move, and everything is equal, and the white king is under pressure. Okay, the engine says that white is much better, but it's not so obvious why white is much better. Here most people play queen h4, and then white, and then white will have to find the only move for white to get a big advantage. Is very difficult, I would say, b4. If you don't play b4, actually the game is around equal. But the engine says, okay, he now brings the bishop to b2, and white has big advantage. So maybe better is to go to f6 to not allow b4, and it's maybe playable position, I think, this. Okay, so this is if they go knight c4. d4 is the main move, and then d6, and then knight c4. Black takes, knight c3. This is considered to be the best line for white, sorry. Now black goes queen g6. There are some other moves, but c6 looks interesting, because you might say, now I have queen e6 and my next move is d5. So this is a fork. So you can try this for the blitz games, because white can be afraid, or he can make some blunder to give the knight. But actually here, white is not only is not losing, but he is winning, because he can give some check. And now the point is that you want to somehow to force him to take on c8. So you take this knight, and then the other knight is trapped. But unfortunately it's not so easy to do it, because when you go to d8, they take on b7. And you go here. It's still not so easy for white. Let's say he takes. I think this was the best move, to take, and now again both knights are hanging. But he goes there, and surprisingly black cannot do anything to win one of those knights, and you are just 2 pawns down. Bishop f4 check is coming. Or if you go to d7, hoping now that maybe after knight c8 you just take on e2 and then take on c4, he now have this very annoying move, knight f7. And if you take knight e5, so basically you have to take the knight, but then he takes the rook, and the problem could be that maybe you are not going to capture this knight on h8, so you can be without a lot of material. So c6 is interesting, but not quite working. Queen g6, and now of course white have many options. The main move is f3, but let's first see some other also quite popular moves. It could be, of course, bishop f4 is perfectly fine move for white, developing the bishop, and then black also develops. So the plan for black is always bishop e7 and castle, and after that it all depends, of course, what white will do. This knight often goes to e3, and then white can try to stop the castle. In this case you have to, of course, try to push d5, and if white plays castle, d5 is just good for black. So normally white is playing d5 himself, and this is a bit tricky here, because now you still cannot castle. If you go c5, it could be knight b5 coming. So here the main move is knight h5, and white moves the bishop, so you have to eliminate this bishop, so there is no pressure on d6, and then simply knight d7 and knight e5, and then bishop d7, and at some point you have to push c5 if you want to castle kingside, and it's I think okay for black. If they play immediately knight e3 without bishop f4, this is the second most popular line, and then they just want to castle, you have to start at some point with c6 to enable d5, and now again some people go d5 immediately, others go bishop e7. Both are possible. The most critical line is always when white plays f3. If white don't plays f3, black don't have any problems. f3, and then the thing is that the queen is under pressure, but you can go in this case queen h5. So here, if they take with the queen, of course the endgame is just perfectly fine for you. And then we go to the main move f3, which is the best for white. You have to take, and now black have to move some of the knights. More popular is knight c6, but here the problem is after bishop d3 that you have to move the queen. The best is to go to g4, and now white is better. The question is, how much better is he? The main move is and probably the best one is queen e3, exactly this check from here. And then after bishop e7, white have to castle to sacrifice the pawn. But I think it is not so terrible to take this pawn. And then they go knight d5, black has to take. Obviously white has a lot of development. And then he goes knight d5. So you have to develop something. They take the pawn, you go back, and this is one position which obviously white is better, but it's not totally winning. So it is one of the, I think this is one of the best lines for white, and it's not so tragic one as it you can imagine after the opening. Most people actually don't take this pawn, they go knight f6, but then white really puts pressure on with the queens if he knows again the best lines, which are rook f4. So white have to remember all this sequence of moves, which is not obvious and not so standard ideas. So then the queen goes back, and then the bishop f5 is, this actually is the key for white. And eventually, if white knows all this, now he also has to know the best move, which is queen e2, because some people try some other lines, but just he has to defend c2, and after knight d5, unfortunately you cannot take on d5 because take, queen h5 check, and after castle, this move knight e3 is also, it doesn't look so scary, and the evaluation is that white has big advantage, but from human's point of view, I don't think it's so terrible for black, as the king is saved, the material is equal, half of the white pieces are not developed, the bishop on c1, the rook on a1, you can play c5 or a5 or knight a6, knight c5. It's, I don't know, it doesn't seem to me that it's a lost position for black. So, in general, this is what you have to know about this Latvian Gambit. I think it's interesting for a surprise, because usually white is not prepared for this. When you play with white and you play e4, e5, knight f3, you prepare for, you know, knight c6, for knight f6, for Philidor, but you don't think about f5, and maybe you have seen something, you know that you have to play knight e5 and then d4, but after that usually even the grandmasters, they just know the first 6-7 moves, and then they think, okay, I know that I am a little bit better, so it's okay for me. So I wish you good luck with this opening, and see you in the next chapters.